Something I was incredibly surprised to find missing from the vast majority of launch day reviews, including from big folk like Linus, was test results from each type of core in Intel's new Alder Lake CPUs. If you didn't know, these new chips feature a hybrid design, which you can think of like having two very different CPUs under one heatsink. But let me explain.
But first, a message from this video's sponsor, ASRock. Their new Z690 boards are here with full support for Intel's latest 12th generation CPUs, DDR5 memory, and PCIe Gen 5, along with ASRock's Lightning gaming ports, Realtek ALC 1220 HD audio codec, Intel Killer Double Shot Pro with 2.5 gigabit Ethernet and AX1675 Wi-Fi, and plenty more. Find out more about them at the link in the description below.
Basically, the P-cores, or performance cores, are the full-fat, high-power monsters we're used to calling cores in Intel CPUs. These are an evolution of the same design, or similar design from the 11th gen chips and before. They boost like crazy up to 5.2 GHz in the i9, feature hyperthreading, and are pretty large on the die. By contrast, the E-cores, or efficiency cores, are tiny. They're grouped in clumps of 4, and those groupings take up just a touch less space than a single P-core, which means that you can fit 4 of the efficiency cores for every 1 P-core, although they don't support things like hyperthreading, so they only have 1 thread per core, and can only boost up to around 3.9 GHz at most in the i9, but are meant to draw significantly less power than their P-core counterparts. The idea of including both on a single chip is that the lower power E-cores will handle all of the background tasks, while the P-cores get to be switched off, saving power. Then when you fire up a game or a render, they'll kick into action and offer some exceptional performance, then switch back off again when you're done. The trouble with that idea is that it isn't exactly simple to know what counts as a background task or even a high performance task. Linux, and by extension Android, has had kernel level support since 2012 and has evolved it since then, and Apple has been using some version of the big little design since 2016 and again has had some considerable development since then as well. By contrast, these Alder Lake chips are the first major sort of launch of this hybrid design that Windows is actually going to have to seriously optimize for, hence Windows 11 existing. Now, if these new chips exclusively used just the P-cores, well, then this would be a pretty standard launch. It'd be just like every other new CPU, and testing the chip as a whole would make perfect sense. But seeing as they don't, and they do in fact include these E-cores, I think it's really important to see how each of them perform independent of each other. I covered some of this in both of the CPU reviews, which I highly recommend you check out. I'll leave them in the cards above for you. But for this video, I wanted to retest a few things since I think I got a couple of little things, wrong, and I collect a few more details as well. So what's the big deal? How different could they be anyway? Well, how about 100%? As in, the P-cores offer almost 100% more performance on single-threaded work like Cinebench R23. The E-cores in both the i5 and i9 run at about half the performance of their respective P-cores. Now, that is completely to be expected. I mean, they run at much lower clock speeds. They don't support hyperthreading, not that that's a significant factor in single-threaded work, but still worth noting. And they are much, much smaller with significantly reduced computational power, so obviously they're going to perform worse. What makes this interesting though is their power usage. The P-cores Well, they draw around about 40 watts of package power during a single-threaded workload like Cinebench R23, but the E-cores? Well, they're about 23 watts, with a peak of actually up to 28. That correlates quite clearly with their performance, with a sort of negative offset for the E-cores. I'm actually quite surprised that they end up drawing that much. I was expecting them to draw less than half the power, not more. When it comes to multi-threaded workloads, also unsurprisingly, the P-cores offer an order of magnitude more performance. Comparing 8 P-cores and 16 threads to 8 E-cores and 8 threads in the i9-12900K, the P-cores offer 150% more performance, at least in Cinebench R23. Looking at the power consumption though, that's where the efficiency difference stands out much more clearly. The P-cores chew through an insane 232 watts as a stable load, or 238 watts at peak, whereas the E-cores practically sip power by comparison at 51 watts stable or 60 watts peak. That works out to around 4 times the power for the P-cores, while providing around 2.5 times more performance. What's also interesting to see is that when you add the individual results from the 12600K's different cores together, you get a result that's slightly higher than their stock combined result. While there is some room for margin of error here, the disabled P-cores mean that the entirety of the power budget is made available to the P-cores, rather than at stock where the E-cores are just skimming a little off the top. With the E-cores disabled, it's also a good time to look at how a more true representation of the generational improvement compares to its peers. The i9 still definitively punches above its weight, clocking in 22% more performance than the 10-core 10850K, almost 40% more performance than last gen's 8-core 11900K, and only comes in around 10% slower than the 12-core Ryzen 5900X. Beating an 18-month-old 10-core by over 20% with only 8 cores is no mean feat, and coming in at just 10% slower than AMD's current generation 12-core is nothing to be ashamed about. For me, that's what makes these chips so interesting and actually impressive. It's a significant improvement gen on gen, almost 40%, without the extra E-cores. Now what about something a little bit more real world? Well, in Blender and the BMW scene, the 8 E-cores take a little over 5.5 minutes to render, whereas the P-cores take just 2 minutes and 10 seconds. Well, it's no longer a fair 8v8 comparison like it is with the i9. The i5's 6v4 is significantly more extreme. The E-cores take over 11.5 minutes compared to the P-cores 3 minutes and 6 seconds, although interestingly, the i5 P-cores are significantly more efficient than the i9s, meaning they draw around 275% more power than the E-cores, but offer around 230% more performance, or much closer to a 1-to-1 ratio. That difference gets extrapolated greatly in the Gooseberry render, thanks to its increased render time, kind of in general. The i9's 8 P-cores takes 11 minutes and 13 seconds to render the frame, versus a whopping 32 minutes for the 8 E-cores, which at the same power draw means that the gap is a lot closer, almost 200% more performance for around 300% more power. Interestingly though, the i5 actually swings in the P-core's favour fully, as they offer over 300% more performance, but for the same 230% more power, meaning that the E-cores actually used a little over 20% more power to complete that render, since drawing 36 watts for over an hour, actually an hour and 6 minutes, ends up with a higher total consumption than 120 watts for 16 minutes. Comparing to their respective peers again, the i9's P-cores again sit with a comfortable lead over the last two generations of i9s, although all are now also a sizable chunk behind the 12-core Ryzen 5900X, which is to be expected. It's still only a 25% margin, which considering the 5900X has 50% more cores, well, that's not bad at all. The i5, on the other hand, doesn't fare quite as well, only ending up with a 4% lead over the 6-core Ryzen 5600X, as these chips tend to struggle in longer workloads compared to Ryzen. As for their E-cores, the 8 in the 12900K sit somewhere between an i3-10100 and an i5-10400F, offering around 15% more performance than the i3, but about 30% down on the i5. As for the 12600K's 4 E-cores, well, the only thing that I've ever tested that ran slower was a severely throttled 1185G7 in a Lenovo Yoga Ultrabook, although a better cooled 1165G7 in the Razer Blade Stealth handily outpaced it, while drawing around the same or even slightly less power. One final thing I want to note before we jump into the gaming results is a bit of an observation. Since the i9's P-cores draw around 28 watts per core in all-core workloads, and the E-cores draw between 25 and 30 watts per cluster of 4, and that cluster of 4 takes up roughly the same space as one E-core, it's conceivable that Intel could make a 10P plus 0E design of this chip and still maintain both the same die size and the same power envelope. That would also alleviate any issues with the scheduler sending tasks to the slower E-cores, and with my napkin maths, it would still put it over 10% faster than the 12-core 5900X, with more consistent performance too. Of course, that's technically a slower chip overall than this 8P plus 8E design, as the 8 E-cores are able to offer more performance per watt than 2 more P-cores, but I do think that it was an interesting thought experiment, if nothing else. Okay, let's get on to gaming. Unsurprisingly, the performance difference between the P and E cores on both chips is pretty significant. In CSGO, the E cores get considerably less performance, actually less than half the average FPS, and it's also worth noting that on both chips I experienced significant stuttering and hitching, with the i5 struggling a whole lot more. The playing experience on the i9 was mostly fine with the occasional hiccup, whereas the i5's E-cores alone was almost unplayable. Interestingly, when adding some more chips in for comparison, the i9's P-cores actually gain a touch more performance over stock. In Cyberpunk, the story is much the same. The E-cores offer significantly reduced performance, although the i9 sporting 8 of them results in actually a reasonable experience overall, whereas the just 4 on the i5 was again pretty unplayable. Also again, disabling the E-cores actually improves performance over the stock results here too. That could be a scheduler issue or more to do with the power budget, but it is worth noting if you have any of these chips that it might be worth something you try out to see if you can increase your performance. Unfortunately, Watch Dogs straight up refused to run on either set of E-cores, so I will have to skip over the results for that one, although I will mention that Intel says 32 different games with Denuvo currently aren't compatible with these new Alder Lake CPUs, so this issue might not be exclusive to Watch Dogs. In Microsoft Flights, again, it sees a performance increase using just the P-cores on both chips. Although, actually, the E-cores do, well, of course they do suffer performance loss, it's a remarkably good average frame rate. It doesn't drop to an insane degree, actually regardless of running on 4 or 8 of those E-cores. And finally, in Fortnite, this is the only game that didn't improve much, if at all, on the P-cores alone, and actually remained a relatively playable experience on the E-cores as well. Performance does take a pretty significant hit, going from 274 FPS average on the i9's P-cores to 179 on the E-cores, or from 266 on the i5 to 129, but it was still remarkably playable. I think testing on the E-cores alone gives a good indication of what we can expect from some of the lower end chips, especially the mobile and ultra mobile options, some of which I could imagine only coming with 4 or 8 of these E-cores. Of course, I am testing with an RTX 3080 desktop GPU, so it's unlikely that especially that gaming performance will translate directly to the mobile and ultra mobile performance, but I think it's interesting to see nonetheless. Looking at the results, especially from the i5 without its E-cores active, I'm personally more excited for the non-hybrid versions of these chips. A 6P plus 0E design would potentially offer more gaming performance, cost less, and have no issues with schedulers, and that certainly sounds like a win to me. I would be very interested to see how a 10-core i9 actually stacks up, especially with the thermal hotspot issues I noticed in my review. With such high power consumption in such a small die, it's just really difficult to evacuate heat away fast enough, making the central cores spike pretty highly in temperature. It's also interesting to see the power consumption on the E-cores, which seems to be sitting somewhere between 6 and 9 watts per core in all core workloads, which is coming remarkably close to what AMD is currently offering in their full-fat Zen 3 cores, and of course with significantly less performance. Comparing to Apple's M1 Pro and Max chips, well, they're drawing more like 3 to 4 watts per core while providing 60% more all-core performance, or a shocking 280% more single-threaded performance at half the power consumption, at least according to AnandTech. That is absolutely insane, and I think that Intel could probably do with a few more generations of both core designs to significantly reduce power consumption while still either maintaining or improving their performance, especially as, at least from what Intel have said in their press releases and press conferences, these core designs, especially the P-core ones, are meant to be the sort of foundation for what they're doing for the next at least couple of generations. And I think that might be, well, it's going to be very interesting, as AMD only, I think yesterday or the day before, had a launch of, or an announcement of Zen 4 and Zen 4C, showing some pretty significant improvements. So it's going to be very interesting to see how both of those stack up in the coming, well, probably months and years as we get new generations. But with all of that said, those are my thoughts and the test results, but I would love to know your thoughts in the comments down below. What do you think of these new chips? What do you think of the hybrid design and the performance difference between the P-cores and E-cores? Do you think that they should have gone with something like a 10-core design instead and kept it more standard? Do you think this hybrid design makes sense for the desktop, or would you rather see a more different style of hybrid design instead, with sort of different maybe attributes or performance differences between them? Feel free to let me know in the comments down below. As always, I'll leave some links to these new CPUs in the description for you to check out. Those will be Amazon affiliate links that will take you to your local Amazon store where you can see pricing when and where you watch this. And you can also support the channel in a whole load of different ways, including using those links, but also just by hitting the subscribe button and turning on the bell notification icon. Or you could support directly through the YouTube join button, where you get access to our MoneyMin Discord chat, sponsor-free videos, and some cool emojis to use in the comments and on our weekly live streams. Or you could also support on Patreon instead, or even pick up a hoodie or t-shirt like this one. There's also a load of other links in the description, both to that stuff, but even just to affiliate links or places like Overclock UK if you're buying from there, VPN options, Humble Bundle, Streamlabs OES, and a whole load of other stuff, so feel free to check it out. Of course, there will be plenty more videos on the end cards as well if you want to keep watching. If you haven't already seen both of the reviews of these chips and the Z690 explained video, I'll leave those on the end cards and on the cards up above for you. Otherwise, thanks for watching, hope you enjoyed it. We'll see you on the next video.